Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Amma Marfo with Mentor Collective, and I am so excited to welcome you to our very first live chat about civic engagement. Now, the reason we're here is to bring a little bit of additional emphasis to a national conversation that's happening right now around all areas of civic engagement. And this particular chat was designed to complement the recently released Civic Engagement Discussion Guide. So for mentors and mentees, if you go into app.mentorcollective.org, you'll be able to access the Civic Engagement Discussion Guide, and we're going to touch on some of the points that came up in that document today with our guest, Adam Gismondi, who is the Director of Impact for Tufts Institute of Democracy in Higher Education. Adam, did I get that right?
Yes, pretty much.
I'll take it. I will take it. So just to get us started, by means of introduction, we're going to each share our name, where we're broadcasting from, and just for the sake of having a little bit of fun with our topic, our favorite fictional civic servant. So it can be a fictional president, fictional member of city or state government, somebody who would, if they were real, contribute to this conversation. So like I mentioned, my name is Amma Marfo. I work in marketing at Mentor Collective. I am broadcasting from Boston, Massachusetts, grew up in Tampa, Florida, and my favorite fictional civic servant is going to be Abe Lincoln, but from the MTV cartoon Clone High. So it's basically him as a high schooler. At one point, he runs for class president. It is all the best parts about Abe Lincoln, but also the awkward parts of being a teenager. And it's so much fun. Adam, what about you?
So hi, everybody. My name is Adam Gismondi, as Amma mentioned. I am calling you from just north of Boston. And I should add that our center is at the Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts. So lots of resources there, which we'll get into later. I grew up in Port Jefferson, New York, which is a small town on Long Island, about an hour outside of New York City. And as Amma knows, I'm a pop culture, aficionado. And so this was like a really challenging question for me. And I challenged myself to think beyond Parks and Rec on this one, which was what came to mind first. I'm going to say either Newman from Seinfeld, the postal worker, or Jack Nicholson as the president in Mars Attacks, because I thought that was just really inspired casting.
Those are both such good answers. And Newman in particular is an exceptional answer because he'd basically be a celebrity at this point because we're all riding so hard for the Postal Service. He would love that.
The Wayne Knight did an in-character promo for the Postal Service I saw online the other day. I haven't fully engaged with it, but it's out there.
All right, gonna make myself a quick note to go watch that. Cool. So, Adam, your path and mine crossed in very different contexts about a decade ago. We were both working on campuses, in student activities, and I'm wondering what kind of steered you in this direction to take some of the experience you had with college students along with some academic interests and turn it into a focus on civic engagement?
I worked in student affairs and higher ed for about 6 years total, and myself had been a college student before that, and during that time was doing my master's. And so I had spent a lot of time really thinking, about a decade of my life, thinking about campus environments, and I was really involved as an undergrad in thinking about what the college experience means and what it can be for college students. And for me, I saw a couple of things that were sort of like worth looking at more. Like there were sort of positive and negatives to them, but I spent a lot of time thinking about how technology was changing the student experience and how campus was no longer just like the physical spaces of campus, but actually the student experience really was happening in online spaces, whether schools wanted them to or not. And so there were periods where there would be like campus gossip websites that were driving what was happening at the school or talking about it. Social media platforms were sort of constantly evolving. That was driving things like everything from advertising, student engagement opportunities to just like the ways that people met each other at an institution. And at the same time, I've always been really interested in politics and political learning at schools. And so I was like really thinking about that intersection of like, what responsibility does a college or university have to our democracy, and what role can it have? So I moved to Boston, and after I finished working down in Florida in student affairs, and I did my dissertation on how undergraduate social media use was impacting their civic learning and civic engagement. And so that led me down multiple paths, everything from like what we call fake news sometimes to activism and traditional engagement. And during that time, my office at Tufts was created. And so I was really interested in it, and it hit like a really unique area that I thought was somewhat unaddressed, largely. So I kept my eye on it the whole time I was doing my doctorate. And then when a position to open, I really, really wanted it, and thankfully it worked out.
And now here you are, managing to find all of those different areas of interest and areas of focus, really in a place that almost feels tailor-made for that convergence of interests.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very lucky. But the nice thing about Boston is that we have, it's constantly changing, but 40-something colleges and universities in the area. So if you're going to work in higher ed, it's not a bad place to be for that.
Most definitely. There are so many options. And yeah, to have one open, like a space that specific open up where you already were, that's even better.
Yeah.
So in light of everything that you've been able to learn and put together, I'm wondering, how would you broadly define civic engagement? Because I know we talk about it around now because it feels so tightly connected to voting, but there's so much more to it, right?
Mm-hmm. So if I was writing out a definition, it might look a little different than me speaking it aloud. But what I would say is, like speaking at like a really broad level, there's some people that define civic engagement really narrowly, and some people who define it really broadly. And I'm someone who defines it more broadly. I think I'm pretty generous with what I would consider civic engagement. I think it's sort of about participating in the things that affect the public interest. And so that, yes, that means like voting, and it means volunteerism. So it might mean like volunteering at a, like the traditional things like in literature, it's like if you're volunteering at a soup kitchen, or you're working as part of a campaign, or you're going to cast a ballot, like those things are certainly part of it. I also would consider activism a big part of civic engagement. I consider reading the news a different type of civic engagement, but I think staying active with the issues and being willing to have conversations and actually engaging in the topics, there's sort of all these buckets. And the way that I've conceptualized it in writing before, it's like, you have your activism quadrant, you have volunteerism, you have more political work and things that address long-term social problems. And then you have like overlaps between those 4 areas, but that's kind of how I would consider it, I think.
Okay. Yeah. So definitely more broad than most people might be thinking initially.
Yeah, and like there are people out there who would make the case that civic engagement is about participating in, like the first thing that comes to mind is like participating in your local faith institute, so like a church or something like that. And there's some people who would say civic engagement is me voting and holding a protest sign and volunteering for a campaign, and it's like these 3 things. For me, it's sort of a moving, a little bit of like an evolving concept, but I would consider even something like, posting information about an issue of public interest, like on your Instagram story. I think that that's, a different level of risk involved. And I think you could like chart that and say how much personal risk is involved versus how how difficult is it to do versus like how much impact does it have. But it's the important thing is that it exists on that spectrum for me somewhere.
Gotcha. So speaking a little bit about voting first, because I think that's the piece that we kind of talk about most often. For younger voters, or maybe people that are doing it for the first time, there's a lot of conversation back and forth about, should I do it? Does it have an impact, and all of those other things? And I'm wondering, what argument would you make to convince somebody that was on the fence to do so if they're able?
So this is a question that I struggle with personally a lot, because I think that there are people out there who rightfully feel disenchanted with the system. They feel unrepresented, and they feel like voting is basically just perpetuating and endorsing a system that doesn't represent them in some way. And there's people of all political stripes who feel that way, but I think one of the most valid groups for that are people that are historically marginalized. So I think like kind of step one, and for me, is like I don't necessarily always feel like I have to convince the person right away. You know, it's more like a conversation of you know, it's not necessarily like right or wrong, but what I often will tell people that are, you know, potentially young voters is, if you decide not to vote, that is, you are participating in the race in a way. It's the people that decide most elections in this country are non-voters. And that was true in 2016. That's true in most Senate races. There are a lot of people out there who don't vote, who, if they decide not to vote, join a voting block of people who decide not to vote. I realize that's like a little bit of a confusing thing to say maybe, but what you're doing is there's sort of one big pie of political influence, and each vote in some ways has some measure of that. And what you're doing by not voting is basically giving your piece of the pie over to someone else. I think that it's really unfortunate in this country, and in some cases disgraceful, how people have been disenfranchised over the years. But one of the things that people need to understand is that voting is one way to kind of demand your seat at the table. It's not the only thing to do, but it's sort of a step in the process, and it's a piece of what you can do. So if you're angry for whatever reason at politics, the state of the country, you know, the state of global politics, one thing that you can do to make your voice heard is to vote. And I would point people to Stacey Abrams wrote an op-ed, I think in the New York Times a few months ago, and it was one of the best arguments I've seen for this around. It was better than I can articulate it, so I will point you to that, and I can pull that up if you want. But yeah. Actually.
Yeah, I think that it's a way of having a conversation about voting alone won't necessarily do it, but as far as the systems that we have in place, it may be the best option that we have if you're able to take advantage of it. And I think a lot about what makes voting difficult, not just logistically, which I feel like we've encountered so many logistical challenges around voting, but also in terms of the information we use to make the decisions that are reflected on our ballots. And I know that you have a lot of feelings and knowledge in particular about misinformation. So I'm wondering if you can define it for us, and also let us know what we can do to kind of avoid being swayed by inaccurate or sometimes actively malicious sources.
So misinformation I would define as information that's incorrect. And the space where that's had the most attention has been in digital spaces the last few years, rightfully, because that's where the majority of people get their news and information. But I would add another term to this, which is disinformation, which is information that's wrong, but it's there's an agenda behind why it's wrong. So it's intentionally misleading people. If you want to see a really interesting breakdown of like a typology of mis and disinformation, there's an organization called First Draft.
that has amazing resources on this. They kind of help you understand, like, okay, well, it's not just that the headline is wrong, or it's not just clickbait or that sort of thing. It kind of helps you break down a little bit an understanding of it. But broadly, the way to understand it is that it's information that's just not true. And it's a huge problem. I mean, it's something that I think is hard to overstate how big of a problem it is right now, because it erodes our democracy, it erodes our trust in one another, it erodes our trust in institutions that have long been trusted. I think that there are some reasons for that, and I think that there, one piece that's kind of downstream of misinformation and people being more skeptical is that we're sort of rightfully evaluating, like, who do we trust and why. And I think a little bit of skepticism is healthy. But I've done a lot of talks on misinformation in the last handful of years, and one thing I've always said, it's, one of my big slides says that this is a public health issue. You can think of it around vaccination misinformation. You can think of it around any number of crises around the world. But I think one thing around 2020 is that it's sort of hammering home that this is a public health issue. People that do not understand the implications of the COVID pandemic are being, misled, and they end up facing personal and, familial family health crises as a result of it. So in terms of what can we do to prevent being swayed by inaccurate or malicious sources, there's a ton of great work out there where you can do kind of exercises to test yourself. The New York Times does some stuff on this. There's a few researchers out there who have created like online modules where you can practice, what can I tell if this is real or fake, or if I can tell if this is an ad or if this is actual content in like a news magazine. But one of the tips that I think is really, really useful is this idea of reading laterally, and the concept of, you see a piece of news. How do you confirm if it's true? This sounds like incredibly simple, but if you go to Google and like confirm it across multiple sources that you trust, that is a good way to do it. At some point, you need to figure out who you trust. This is not just about figuring out what you don't trust. Research on this has shown that younger people in particular use heuristic clues to figure out if something's true or not, meaning they use like little bits and pieces of the online environment to say, oh, like this web address looks a little bit fishy to me, or some of the ads on this page are strange, or the way the headline is written is meant to appeal to me emotionally, and it doesn't seem like a normal news source. And like they can kind of piece it together a little bit, and some people are good at that. But another way to do it is to figure out, if you feel there's bias in certain sources, to try to find somewhat of a mainstream source that you do trust. And I'm not here to render judgment on which ones are right or wrong, but I think that the more you take in, the more you can start to sort out, like over time, which sources you trust the most. So the way that news spreads is very quick these days, and so hopefully, you can a news story hits on CNN, and you can confirm that with ABC or CBS or something like that.
Yeah, and I think that can get complicated sometimes, like when news is broken on social media. Like I think more than once, like a celebrity death, for example, is broken because somebody posted it on like Instagram, and then kind of having that lag in time where it isn't confirmed by a major source, and you have to figure out what to do with that information, and kind of weighing speed against accuracy and all of those other things. So it's so much more complicated than I think we might initially give it credit for.
It's funny you say that, because when I was interviewing students for my dissertation, it was in the 2013 to 2015 range. And it was before fake news had become a term used by politicians in any sort of wide scale way. but I was really interested in what at the time we were calling information quality and news quality. And so a lot of the conversations I had with students and focus groups and interviews was, have you ever been tricked by a story that ended up not being true? Or we'd talk about things like that. And the thing that came up again and again was celebrity deaths. That almost every student I talked to had some experience of them or like their friends or their group or whatever announcing something to their other friends, and then a few minutes later finding out it was a hoax, or in some cases it being true. So I think that's been almost like a training vehicle for some people of breaking news in that way, because it's like Wikipedia or Twitter or some places like that. Like, it's open source. I mean, that's the beauty of it, but it also means that anyone can post what they want for the most part. So yeah, this is an iterative thing, and I'll just say that also we're kind of at the infancy of a lot of these technologies. So I think hopefully over time it'll get figured out a little bit better, and we'll all get better at doing it. But it's new, so it's a little bit dangerous in that way.
Yeah, that's a good point. So moving a little bit away from some of the elements of it that are directly connected to voting, I'm wondering what other types of advice or methods of engagement would you recommend for people who are either unable to vote for one reason or another, have elected not to vote, but might still want to be involved, or in the case of early voting, have already voted and feel like, what else can I or should I be doing?
So we, in our office, we work with college students mainly, and this is a question that comes up a lot because we have students that are undocumented on college campuses. We have people that are international students who are ineligible to vote, or there's many reasons why someone might not be able to vote in an election. Or as you said, maybe they voted early, or it's kind of like, what do I do between now and election day or after? One line of our work we call Politics 365, which refers to this idea that this is something that happens year round. It's not just about an election. Elections are nice for civic engagement in our context on campuses, because they provide attention and a spotlight and something for people to talk about. It's kind of like a rallying point for civic engagement. I'm not so sure that this year we really need that as much, because I just feel like there's been so much attention in the last 4 years. It's so like we're now at like a super heightened level of engagement among people. But what I'll say is that there's so much work to be done in this space. And I don't mean that in like that it's all hard. I mean, I think some of this is fun work. And some of it is challenging in good ways. So I think that people can engage in conversations. There are endless amounts of volunteer programs that you can join, ways that you can phone bank, you can volunteer in person for things if you feel safe to do so. And none of this has to be affiliated with a political party or a candidate even. There are so many great social groups out there, no matter what you believe in, that you can volunteer with, that you can kind of read through their materials and see like, well, where do I stand on this? And I'm a big fan of like really challenging your own beliefs, in the sense that I think that when you say like, oh, I feel this way about a particular issue, it's really important to ask yourself, well, why? And one of the really hard ways to do that, but I think impactful ways to do that, is to have a conversation with someone who disagrees with you, either that's like further right than you or further left than you, or kind of off the traditional political spectrum, because it makes you understand your own viewpoint a little bit better and forces you to be able to articulate, well, here's why I believe in this, and this, why I have this position on a particular issue. So I think learning more about topics that really drive your own political identity is really important during this time. And if you feel comfortable to do so, I think volunteering and finding a way to support whatever it is that is like kind of your issue or issues of choice, now is as great a time as any to do that work. People, a lot of these groups need help.
So let's jump a little bit into the conversation element of it, because one piece of the discussion guide that we did make sure was available to mentors and mentees alike was the guidance on having discussions and conversations, which aren't always easy to do. So I'm wondering, what advice do you have for people who are nervous about having some of those conversations with friends and acquaintances or with family members, especially if they anticipate that they'll disagree?
Yeah. This is a tough one because I think most of us, if not all of us, have had an experience where we feel it's really hard sometimes to have a conversation with a loved one that you just disagree with strongly on an issue or broadly on political issues. My advice is, number one, to understand your own viewpoints and why you have them, because I feel like there's nothing more frustrating than getting into one of these conversations and not being able to say, well, here's why I believe in this, and at least being able to get your thoughts out. So that kind of goes back to the previous question. And so I think it's really important to know where you stand and why. And to also understand, like, maybe you don't have a fully formed view on something and that you're open to discussion about it. We produce discussion guides for students, and one of the things that I try to do when putting those together is think about issues that create kind of strange alliances. So, for instance, earlier this year, I did one of these facilitated conversations, and the topic that I chose was technologies, advancements, and surveillance.
Okay.
So we talked about everything from, cameras on streets of main streets and towns, and that being like something that maybe is in some ways helping, the argument is that it's helping police the neighborhood. But then there's also surveillance on your iPhone or your Android or on your computer or on your television or on your smart remote for your TV. And thinking about in what ways are you being monitored, even if like in your web browsing or, anything along those lines. And what I found was that people that maybe identified strictly as a Republican or strictly as a Democrat were starting to agree. And then people that agreed sometimes were disagreeing. So I really love finding those issues that can kind of transcend that. And there's just like a whole array of topics where you can talk about finding some of those points of conversation. But I would say, to go back to the original point of this, I think with friends and acquaintances, I think it's really important to listen, to hear what they have to say, and ask the other person to explain themselves if they're comfortable doing so. And for you to ask for them to listen to you and to have kind of an honest conversation about, well, here's where I stand. And I think that we don't have as many opportunities for that in a reasonable way as maybe we should. So I think if you're able and open to having those conversations, I think it can be a useful thing for yourself, even if you're just looking at it as like from a selfish perspective of just like, I just want to grow as a person. An important caveat that I would add to that, though, is I think like you also have to look out for your own mental health and your own well-being, based on your own lived experiences and based on your own personal connection to issues in particular. I think it's okay to back out of a conversation. Like we are very pro civic engagement in our office, and I am personally very pro, civic dialogue. But I also think that there's a point where it's not always necessarily healthy to keep fighting on an issue if it's really impacting you personally. And I think it's okay to step out and look out for yourself if a situation is toxic or if it's like especially burdensome for you. And so that's what I would say is kind of balancing all of those considerations.
Yeah, one of the things that I know as we were putting together the discussion guide, really liked about some of the Tufts resources is going into these types of conversations in good faith. And you can choose to not participate in a conversation if you suspect it's not being held in good faith. So if someone is actively trying to antagonize you or trying to maybe reduce your humanity over the course of a conversation, you don't have to participate in that conversation. And I think giving people that permission is also a big part of this, while also not letting that be the catch-all where it's like, oh, well, I'm uncomfortable. That's a little bit different. So trying to figure out what's true for you, what you want to convey in the conversation, and at what point is it no longer worthwhile to engage in it. All of those pieces kind of matter.
Yeah. And recognizing that, like you said, it's a part of humanity. It's not anything to be ashamed of, and it's not anything to be, to shame others on. It's simply a matter of, like, some of these things are difficult, and different people have different experiences. So,
yeah, absolutely. So going from some of these smaller conversations that can help change minds to maybe larger versions of that, what role do you think activism should play in how we think about civic engagement? So that can be things that are as public and as potentially disruptive as marches or as sit-ins or fundraising, all different ways to kind of engage with the activist piece of civic engagement. Where do you see those two fitting together?
I think I would answer this question depending on who asked it, maybe a little differently. And by that I mean, like, for me, like I said, my population of who I normally work with are college campuses. And so I'll try to answer it that way. And maybe it's a little bit of a microcosm of what I would say more broadly. And I'll start with kind of a related anecdote. So when I was doing my work earlier in the decade, on more focused directly on social media platforms, I worked with a professor now down at Sam Houston State on a piece for NASPA on Yik Yak, which was becoming more and more prevalent on campuses. And one of the pieces of our argument was that schools shouldn't ignore what's happening on there per se, but should look at it as a mirror of campus, but like a funhouse mirror, like a distorted version of what's happening, but that there is useful information in there. And the information may be things that you don't want to know about your school. It may be things that you don't want to believe about your institution, that there are instances of hate speech or racist behavior or misogyny, like those sorts of things, and that there's a validity to the need to address those issues in that space. In a somewhat parallel way, I think activist movements often start as there's a reason for them often. Like, there's a pushback to something that's happening that's making people angry. And so the example at University of Missouri, in which, and this is kind of the beginnings of the Black Lives Matter movement that happened, and we're talking like 6 or 7 years ago or so in that area. There were racial incidents on campus that were going unaddressed by the college president there, and students were angry about it, and they were saying, can this institution do something to fix these problems? And it was largely going ignored, and the problem escalated, and the activism escalated as a result, because people were saying, we want to be heard on this issue in a very fair way, I would argue. And in that case, one of the things that sort of pushed things over the top was the football team saying, we're not going to play next week. And it was estimated that it was going to cost the school around $1 million per weekend that the team decided to sit out playing. And like, you can look across the country at all different schools and see that what often starts as one incident or a series of incidents that students raise attention to in a way that I think is, almost any administrator would say is kind of like a fair way of showing a viewpoint, like, students showing some level of peaceful protest or activism. It starts there often, and then but it shows you like what's happening. And so this is why it's so important to bring in diverse voices across like any sort of consideration you might have to the table in decision-making processes and organizations, including at colleges and universities, because you want to know what's happening and you can't have just like a myopic, well, here's how I view what's happening at the school, and that's not really a problem, so we're not going to deal with it. It will, the issue will grow if it goes unaddressed, especially on some of these kind of long-term social issues. So anyway, I think what I'm trying to say in a very long and inarticulate way is that I think activism shows you where some of your biggest social problems are. And so, it's important that we pay attention to if we're not part of the movement, like what's happening. And if we are part of the movement, that we understand that what our rights are. And ultimately, I think that activism is a central part of civic engagement, and it's an American thing to do. It's a piece of our democracy, is that we can protest and share our beliefs on different issues.
Well, and to your point about kind of looking at it at first from the context of college campuses, I think that's valuable because, so for example, everything that happened in Ferguson that kind of kicked off the Black Lives Matter movement as it was named happened in 2014. But in 2013, I remember doing all of this research and talking to people on campuses where students were protesting, and people not in campus environments didn't understand it. They're like, well, why are they protesting about everything? And shouldn't they be spending that time doing other things? And then it became kind of a mantle that we all took up. Protesting became something that was all of a sudden important to everybody. So recognizing it in the college environment was in some ways predicting what it would do on a larger scale. So that was really interesting to me to kind of see play out, going from it being, oh, well, these kids in this environment don't know what's going on, to, oh, they were doing exactly the right thing and we should follow their lead.
Yeah, so I agree. And I think, like I said, I think that there are parallels to that all over, in corporate structures and companies and communities. It's really important to kind of listen to activist moments and movements as they start, because you want to understand why are people unhappy, and see if there are things that are valid and if they can be addressed in any sort of meaningful way.
Yeah, and that piece of validity, I think about that a lot when I talk to students about like trying to make change within any system that they're participating in, thinking about for whom is what you're worried about a problem and for whom is it not a problem. And that second piece sometimes matters because that's the reason that things aren't changing. So if you can kind of make your case in a way that the people for whom it's not a problem can see it being an issue, that's when you start to get that groundswell support that makes things easier to change. Yeah, it's interesting. Man, I haven't thought about Yik Yak in a while. It has been a minute.
Probably for the best that it's now no longer active.
Yeah, we got other stuff to worry about.
Yeah, we've moved on to TikTok.
We have. So I'm thinking a little bit about the debates. So I know we're kind of in an up in the air of, are there going to be any more debates? But assuming that was the case, and even pertaining not necessarily to presidential debates, but also to local ones and things that might be happening for state government or Senate seats, what are your tips for being a productive and thoughtful listener to these conversations? Because in so many ways they feel like spectacle or like something that aren't going to change minds. Why should we watch them, and what should we be looking out for?
In 2020, it's different than in years past. I've had a couple conversations with friends lately about, were the debates always this difficult to watch in years past? And we were kind of revisiting 2016 and 2012 and 2008 and just like going backwards and thinking like, this feels different. This feels almost like an absurd play that I'm watching on stage. And I think understanding and recognizing that is okay, and not going in expecting like a really sound traditional debate is probably the right thing to do, because we're getting some answers that are just, at times nonsensical or elusive, and it's certainly not I'm not one who fights for civility often, actually, but it's certainly not a very civil debate that's happening on stage. So, and I'm mainly speaking about the first presidential debate. All that being said, I think that, we talked earlier about what are your issues? What are the core things that you care most about? I think you should go in and think about, like, what are they saying about, issues A, B, and C that I really care about? And where do the candidates stand on it? My guess is that most people in the audience sort of know where the candidates stand on the issues at hand. I mean, Joe Biden was vice president for 8 years. Donald Trump has been president for 4 years. Like, we have some track records to look at. And so you probably know, like, if you're looking for the issues and where the candidates stand and what they may or may not do to address your concerns about those topics. That being said, I would say, if you can endure it and you're okay with it, watch it and try to take in as much as you can of the debate and try to sift for content and think about, like, well, what are they actually saying about healthcare? What are they actually saying about the environment, if it's being brought up even at all? What are they saying about education? And to the extent that you really care about those issues, it's useful and valid in that way to kind of see it. But part of me actually really liked the idea of, tens of millions of people watching the debates to just kind of see it laid out, because I am old enough that I remember in the year 2000, I was a senior in high school watching the debates, and me personally agreeing with the sentiment that the Bush and Gore were basically the same candidate, that they were just so to the middle, and they were sort of agreeing and saying a lot of the same things, that it just almost seems pointless to me. I think you can say a lot of things about 2020 and about politics in 2020, but I do think that there's a choice. And I think that there are a lot of people that agree with each side, but they're definitely not the same candidate. So you have a choice at hand, I would say, this year, if you're voting for one of the two major parties.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you bring up about kind of comparison to back versions of these back and forths and what they looked like and what they sounded like and what type of information you can meaningfully glean from them. And I've thought about this a little bit, and I kind of wonder, does the structure of it need to change in like a very material way, or do we just need to call it something different? Because I'm the type of person that's very particular about like word choice and what things are called. And I don't know that I would call what we've been watching a debate, but I also think that applies to prior versions of it. That applies in 2016, 2012, to an extent 2008. Like, we might just need to call it something different or structure it in a way that's a little bit closer to a debate. But yeah, I think it's just, it serves such a different purpose than it did in 2000, which I remember those as well.
That's a really good point. Maybe they just need to rebrand it as like a television show or something. But I think structurally, one thing I would suggest, and I'm like a little hesitant about this. I have a former coworker who works on the debate commission now, and I've been like not sending her any input because I'm sure she's heard advice from all corners of the earth at this point. But one thing I'd really like to see, and I've said this for years, like in past debates, and I felt this during the primaries as well, is people were calling for like a mute button of the candidates. What I would actually like to see is, if you are given 2 minutes, that actually what happens is in your final 5 seconds that the volume decreases rapidly. So like you'd have a lot of candidates, if they were reading the question off the screen, they'd be like, and thoughtful listener to the conversation, like trying to like get through their final few words of a thing, and then like forcing themselves to an endpoint. Otherwise, then it mutes. Like something like that would be. There's some like logistical changes I think I would be in favor of, but I I think we're just kind of in a different year right now. And the question is really like, does this point like eventually converge back to like closer to where things were in the past, or does it just like continue outward into a fully chaotic political universe moving forward? And I don't know that. I'm not sure if I wish I knew either.
It is. It's a good question in the sense of, at a time where so many other things kind of seem to be repeating themselves for any number of reasons, is this something that continues to repeat, or is this kind of the point where it just diverges into something different? Does it now need to be different because of where we've now been?
Yeah. Time will tell. Time will tell.
So we are coming up on time. I'm wondering if you have maybe anything that I didn't ask about that you want to make sure gets shared, or any final thoughts to kind of wrap this up. Perhaps something particularly as it pertains to mentorship. So maybe something that mentors could impart upon mentees, or vice versa. Anything you want to kind of wrap us up with?
One of the things that we see in our work is actually that in institutions with like particularly high levels of civic engagement by our measures, that there's a culture of talking politics and like an openness to discussing public issues. And so I would say for mentors and mentees, trying to be open to at least having conversations about what's happening. And it's I know that like we're now at a moment where wearing a mask during a pandemic is is like a political hot button issue somehow, or like what news channels you watch is politically driven. And I mean, like when you look at like the polling data, it's like almost every issue has some sort of partisan difference in terms of what your view is. But I think that there are many issues that like you can have conversations around, like how are the local businesses doing in our town, or what's your favorite, restaurant, and how is it impacted by, COVID-19? And I think that there are things that you can talk about that walk you a little bit into like, well, what should be the policy on this? Like even just locally, or, what should it be in our state? I think it's really important to at least try to connect the dots. And perhaps that's a role that mentors and mentees can play for one another, and have a little bit of a conversation of like, I'm not sure how I feel about this issue. Like, let's talk about it, And I think that that's really all you can ask of people when it comes to like a starting point for conversation is, trying to work through like where you fall on some issues. And I would definitely say if you're eligible to vote and can vote and want to vote, then by all means do so. And if you can early vote and try to do it in a way where you're not in a crowded place, I would certainly encourage you to do that. That's my plan. I know we're all talking about who has a voting plan. That's my plan, is to go vote early. So yeah, I think that's it. Do you have any other questions?
I don't, but I do really like that idea of using the relationships that you build through kind of a mentor-mentee relationship, where a big part of that investment is having conversations with one another, and using that maybe not quite as a testing ground, but as an opportunity to start having conversations that do push you a little bit with someone who's invested in your success, and then being able to kind of use that experience to then have higher difficulty levels of those conversations, I guess, maybe with people for whom the relationship isn't so close, or with whom you have a different type of relationship. So it's a good starting point. It's a good opportunity to start feeling out how to do that.
Yeah, and hopefully that's like a safe place for discussion, right? Like, I mean, if you have a level of trust with somebody and say like, I'm not sure how I feel about this, or I think that I believe this, that can be a really valuable thing, for anybody on the mentee side or on the mentor side, to say, here's how my thinking is evolving on this particular issue. Because it's not always easy. You asked a question earlier about people avoiding political discussion. It can feel a little dangerous or threatening to put your view out there, whether it's in a classroom, or whether it's on social media, or whether it's you know, whether you're sitting on jury duty and, you know, expressing your viewpoint, like, especially nowadays, like, it can really feel, you can feel uneasy about expressing a viewpoint. And so, like, maybe that's a place where you can have a conversation where you start working through, what do I believe, and, like, how do people feel on all sides of this issue? And, you know, after understanding that a little bit more, like, where do I come down on something?
I like that. Yeah, I mean, I think there is no better time and no better opportunity. So, mentors and mentees, if you've heard what we've talked about over the last about 50 minutes or so and want to engage in these conversations further, we do have the discussion guide that's another part of our initiatives to get you talking about this, available at app.mentorcollective.org. And we look forward to hearing from you about how those conversations go. If you have any challenges with the guide, you can let us know at help.mentorcollective.org. And I would also encourage you to take advantage of the resources that Adams Center at Tufts has available. They have a lot of things that can help you get the information you need, some strategy on how to have those conversations, and a lot of other additional resources. So, Adam, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. This has been fun. I know I'm kind of excited to have higher levels of difficulty conversations with people now that we've talked a little bit more about what that can look like and how to do it thoughtfully in an informed way.
Thank you for having me. It's been an honor. And if folks want to reach out, feel free. The best place to reach me is on Twitter at Adam Gismondi, or you can email our office if you want to learn more about the work that we do, idhe@tufts.edu.
Excellent. And I'll make sure that we share that with everybody as well so they can keep in touch. So
Great.
Thank you all so much for watching. We look forward to hearing how the guide goes for you, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, everybody.